Welcome to the show. We've got a great show today. This is part 2 of the project that I started a couple of days ago. We'll actually be finishing up the knife today, and we'll have a little bit of fun testing it out. So where we left off in the last video, I was all the way up through the heat treating process, and we had applied a beeswax finish where you heat the blade of the knife and then apply beeswax to it. And what that does is it helps to protect the knife as well as giving it a really nice, deep, rich, black finish. So with that done, I went over to my super high-tech $30 Walmart tempering furnace, and I tempered the blade for about an hour at 400 degrees. With the tempering part done, I brought it back to the 1x30 and put the finishing touches on the bevel. I had left maybe a 1/16 of an inch of thickness at the edge, so there wasn't a whole lot of work to do here, but when you're dealing with hardened steel, it can still be pretty rough on the belt. So be prepared to go through a couple of belts, especially if you're working with smaller belts like this. Again, I'll call attention to the fact that I am wearing gloves here, and I don't necessarily recommend doing that, but it was very cold conditions in the shop. These are pretty tight-fitting gloves, and I was careful to make sure that they didn't get snagged in the belt. With the edge more or less finished, it was time to put the scales on. For these scales, I'm using some kind of generic oak trim. There are 1,000 different materials you can use for scales on a knife, but this is an inexpensive option you can find at home improvement stores. And when you're working on a budget like I am, inexpensive is definitely the way to go. With the scales cut out to roughly the right shape and size, I always leave a little extra so that there's some to trim back. I position them where I want them on the knife and mark the spots where I was going to drill holes for the pins. I generally don't do like precise measurements. I'll typically eyeball it, and if I decide things don't look quite right, I might make an adjustment before I drill the final holes. Again, if I was making a knife for a client or something like that, I might take a little bit more care to just be very precise about where things are marked out. With the holes drilled, it's time for the glue up. Again, it was very, very cold in the shop, probably right near the low end of the recommended temperature for the epoxy I was using. So you'll see that I'm kind of having trouble stirring it. It's very, very thick. In some ways, that's actually good because I've found with this particular epoxy, it's one of those fast-setting, like 5-minute epoxies. And most of the time, I'm just barely getting things clamped in place when that stuff starts to set. But when you're working at a colder temperature, even though it's a little bit thicker working with it, you do have a few extra minutes to get things positioned before it really sets up hard. Now, just to be sure that stuff cured properly, I did bring it into the house where it was warm. I'm not sure about the strength of the bond. If I was to leave it outside and it got below freezing, that might wreck the whole thing. I really don't know that much about the chemistry involved in these two-part epoxies, but when in doubt, it's always best to follow the manufacturer instructions. So after inspecting everything and making sure that the glue up went well, I ground down the excess from the pins and then pinned them into place. It's really nice working with brass pins because they pin so nicely. And as long as you're reasonably careful, there's very little risk of splitting the wood or doing any kind of damage to the scales. And then really the rest of this process is just kind of taking it slowly, removing material a little bit at a time, making sure to keep the scales cool enough that you don't wind up burning the wood. And I've found that I usually use a variety of tools. I may start with the belt sander to get the bulk of the work done, and then I'll move to something like the Dremel to do finer work. And of course, when it comes to finishing, there really isn't anything that just beats sandpaper and sanding by hand. For this type of project where the overall effect is going to be kind of rustic and antique looking, I really like the look of scorched hardwood handles. But I've learned that this is a really delicate process because if you get too much heat, and it can happen really quickly, you're going to damage the bond between the epoxy, the scales, and the steel. But if you're careful, you definitely can achieve that scorched finish without overheating the glue. And although I've had trouble with it in the past, this time I was very careful, and I can say it was a complete success. To put the finishing touches on the knife, I'm using some boiled linseed oil. This stuff is pretty safe to use. Of course, it's a more or less natural product, but anytime you're using varnish or finishes, it's good to work in a ventilated area and use some protection on your hands. So there is basically the finished knife. I think it turned out rather well, but I did make one more change to this because as I was holding it in my hand, I really felt like the weight was too far forward. It felt a little bit off balance. And so, although I like the profile of the blade, I did wind up changing it, made a couple of alterations, and I think you'll like the finished look. Really, the main difference here is just that I made a clip point on the knife instead of a drop point. But I did it fairly aggressively. I brought it a long ways back up the blade, and I really felt like that was necessary to improve the overall balance of the knife. But in the end, at least to my eye, it also wound up improving the looks. For one thing, the grip of this knife is really quite slender, and so it kind of makes sense to have a blade that's not quite as meaty or quite as wide as that original drop point blade. Of course, I cleaned this up on the 1x30. I did put a little bit of a swedge on the spine side of the blade. That is not sharpened, but it did seem like a swedge was a nice addition with the new clip point. So with that work done, just feeling it in my hand again, once again, the balance is so much improved over what it was before. I put a halfway decent edge on there. I didn't, this isn't shaving sharp or anything like that, but I just wanted to be able to do a couple of tests with it. And of course, it comes as no surprise that with a halfway decent edge on there, it'll slice through paper. Now, naturally, the blade won't be quite as strong with that much material removed, but I wanted to be sure that it was still up to some pretty simple, basic camping type tasks. And to me, when you're talking about a knife of this size, it seems like the biggest test, at least in terms of durability, is to try splitting wood with it. And of course, this isn't something you're going to swing and chop wood with, but it should at least be up to the task of batoning. And as you can see, it had no trouble at all absorbing those blows. No damage whatsoever to the blade or to the edge. You can see it still slices through paper very nicely. And I guess the very last test is just to see how it stands up to another very similar knife that I designed a few weeks ago. So as you can see, this is obviously not a similar knife. This is quite a bit larger. This, of course, is the Moe knife. I don't know if you've seen that video series, but I will link to it here if you want to go check it out. This is a project I completed about, I want to say about 3 weeks ago. Obviously a completely different class of knife. This was designed from the beginning to have the kind of weight that you could use it for chopping and other tasks that would require much greater durability. So the little Hunter Skinner here might not be able to hold its own in a head-to-head match with the Moe, but for what I designed it for, I think it will do really, really well. And of all the knives that I've designed so far, I think this one is probably about as likely as any to actually wind up along with me out in the field on a hunting trip. That is, if I ever find the time to go hunting again. But obviously, that will be a video for another day. If you enjoyed this video, I've got a ton of other videos that are similar, some that are quite a bit different. Absolutely subscribe to my channel. I'd like to hear from you. Any advice you have, any ideas for projects that you'd like to see, or really any other comment you want to leave. So thanks again, and whoever you are, whatever you're doing, have a wonderful day, and we'll see you in the next video.